Welcome to today's program, A Conversation with the Second Generation, the Importance of Telling Our Stories. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope you'll visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust from photographer Martin Schuller. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership, on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Ellen Bachner Greenberg, Joy Wolfe Ensor, and Natalie Iglewicz. Ellen is the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. She is co-founder and president of Descendants of Holocaust Survivors, a group that does programs in partnership with the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, and is also co-presenting today's program with us. Ellen is a charter member of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a member of the Steering Committee for Holocaust Survivors Day, and a member of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. A certified life coach, she facilitates discussion groups for descendants of survivors. Ellen's articles have appeared in numerous publications, and she's writing a memoir about her parents' lives during and after the Holocaust and how it has impacted her. Joy is a psychologist whose clinical teaching and leadership activities over 40 plus years have centered on the social determinants of health and the multi-generational legacy of trauma. She grew up in New York City and has lived in Ann Arbor since 1973. This writing project has deepened her attachment to Krakow, her ancestral home. Joy and her husband, Doug, a fellow psychologist, have two daughters and one granddaughter. Joy has studied classical piano since age 6 and still tackles pieces that are a stretch for her little fingers to play. Natalie was raised in suburban Detroit. Her loving parents, both Holocaust survivors, led by example in valuing hard work, respect for others, and kindness. Natalie received degrees from the University of Michigan, Eastern Michigan, and Wayne State University. Recently retired, Natalie was an educator for 38 years. Her students included adjudicated youth and those with learning differences. Natalie and her husband, Reed Newland, live with their 2 children and 2 dogs who are very cute in Ann Arbor. You can buy The Ones Who Remember, the second generation voices of the Holocaust at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to Ellen.
Great. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Sydney, and thank you to the museum, as always, for doing wonderful programs with us. So, as Sydney said, I am the child of 2 survivors. My father survived, he was born in Berlin, and he survived Auschwitz, Dachau, and several death marches. My mother was a hidden child. She was hidden in a convent, pretending that she was not Jewish. So, why did I invite these authors in this book here today? Because there's so much that I can relate to. We have similar backgrounds, but we have different backgrounds. We have different experiences. And what's really important about this book is not only to keep alive the story of our parents, but to recognize that for survivors, the Holocaust didn't end with liberation in 1945. It never went away for them. It was always there. And I think it's important to see through our lenses as children what we saw. How were our parents impacted? And how were we impacted by our parents? And when I say the word impacted, I use it as a neutral word, because as you'll hear from us that, a lot of people say we were traumatized. I'm not saying we were, we weren't, but neutral is impacted, because you'll hear talk about trauma and there's talk about resilience and strength. So let's start off, Joy. There's 16 authors. This was a project that took many years, done with a lot of hours, a lot of soul searching and love. So why don't you tell us about this?
So I think the first thing I want to say is that we authors didn't originally set out to write a book. We first met each other as members of Temple Beth Emeth, which is a Reform synagogue in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And our then rabbi invited us to craft an original Yom HaShoah service that would be more personal and immediate than what we found in the existing liturgy. That was the beginning of our Generations After group in 2004. So we had this meeting, Natalie and I were there, we were kind of charter members of this group, and we knew immediately that we wanted to center our parents' stories so that our congregation could move past this impossible idea of 6 million and enter into the lives of individual families. We did it, we've been doing it ever since. We also write services for Yom Kippur afternoon to replace the martyrology section of the liturgy. And we just last month led our 20th Yom HaShoah service. So about 10 years in 2014, we realized we'd compiled several hundred narratives from our parents' experiences and said, why don't we put them together into an anthology? How hard could that be? And we distilled those couple hundred narratives into a manuscript and sent it off to readers. It was really only then that the readers said, these stories are important and compelling, but where are you in all of this? And we were taken aback because our first reaction was, it's not about us. You know, we weren't enslaved and we weren't hidden and we weren't starved and we weren't beaten. We've had pretty comfortable lives growing up in America, mostly. But the second barrier that we had to overcome to talk about our own voices was that, you know, up to then, we had talked with sorrow about our parents' suffering and we had talked with pride about their resilience, but it just felt self-indulgent and actually disloyal to talk about their PTSD, their mental health issues, never mind its impact on us. But our reader encouraged us to do this, and one of our beloved elders in our Generations After group, who wrote the foreword to our book, encouraged us to take this deeper dive. And amazingly, every single author said yes. So hineni, here we are now with this book. And, you know, along the way, we lost a beloved author and group member, Myra Fox. We have included her writings in a chapter. We've dedicated the book to her. And the process of finding our own voices was a really unexpected force for growth and healing for us as 2Gs. And we're just thrilled and happy to be here with you this evening.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is quite a journey. And for those of us that want to explore and think about our parents and their past, it is a journey. And in order for you and all the authors to write, you had to have known the stories. So, you know, and, you know, I always think about it. There's many survivors who did not talk. There's many children who didn't want to listen. And, you know, if the child and the parent were matched correctly, if the child who didn't want to hear had a parent who didn't speak, they were well suited. But that wasn't always the way it was. But, you know, let's start with you, Natalie. When I think about the relationships between a parent and a child who wants to talk, I think of you and your parents, and both of your parents and you were on the same page. Your parents wanted to talk, and you listened, and you asked questions, and you kept going back. You know, I've spoken with both Natalie and Joy extensively before, so it's nice that we know each other's stories. And you talk about your parents, that your father talked, his discussions were to teach you a lesson, a meaning and a purpose. When your mother spoke, you had to find a meaning yourself. I thought that was really interesting. So why don't we start with you telling us about your father? What sort of things did your father tell you?
First of all, thank you for bringing that up, though, the idea of like how matched you are, because I think until we did this book and I read everyone else's chapter, I didn't understand or appreciate that match. And so I think I was really fortunate in that, and that my parents were so open. And another way to look at my mother was she had no filter. So that's the other that's the flip side. I asked her a question whether it was age appropriate or not. She told me.
Right.
But my so I kind of think my father's lessons is twofold. One was like old country lessons, and one was, I don't know, new country, learn as you go lessons. But the one story he told me quite often was he was from a small town called Ostrolenka, just outside of Warsaw. And his mother had died when he was 2 years old, and her mother came and lived with him and the other children and his father, and helped raise him. And every Friday morning before sunrise, he would go with her to deliver challahs to people's houses. And she said, we're going before the sun is up so that they will, when they wake up, they'll see these challahs at their doorstep and they won't know who gave it to them. They won't feel shamed. And he said, so therefore, it is really important to give in such a way that people don't feel ashamed. And you should give before people ask, and do it in a way that they don't know. And then, and I would witness him do that, throughout my life, just give charity in that way, in very personal ways. Then the other thing that I think about this all the time now, or as I grew up, it resonated more and more. I lived very close to one of the first malls in the country. It was called Northland. For anyone in the, Michigan, you would know that. And I don't know if I was like 4 or 5, I went for the first time. And it was like a big deal. I'm holding my dad's hand. And it was the first time I saw an African-American man. I said, Dad, that man is burnt. And my father launched into this whole thing about, no, this is a Black man. His people come from Africa. They're a minority here. This was during the civil rights. They're fighting for their rights. Jews are with them. Minorities stick together. Blah, 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 on and on and on. So that was my introduction into race, I guess. And then, I don't know, next visit, I saw a nun. And that's when nuns were wearing their whole regalia, right? And I said, Dad, there's a penguin, in the mall. And he said, oh, no, those are nuns, and they're people of God. And many of them saved Jewish children during the war. You need to show them respect. And really, that's how he taught me tolerance of religion. Yeah, so those are my
those are really nice values, and from what it sounds like, that they're inculcated and incorporated in you, and certainly part of you today. Let's switch to your mother, and I'd like you to read that the passage. So we just heard about the discussions Natalie had with her father, and we'll hear a different sort of conversation with her mother.
Okay. Again, I'm pretty young here too. I don't know, somewhere between 4 and 6. Throughout my early childhood, I was periodically awakened in the middle of the night by my mother's piercing screams. No, no, no. And then her face would suddenly appear above mine. I would ask what happened, because she woke me, and she would answer, nothing, a bad dream, go back to sleep. And I did. In the morning, when she was doing her household chores, I would ask her about a bad dream. It was always the same dream. She would tell me, I dreamt that you and I were behind a barbed wire fence. She would begin, and the Nazis were coming for you. One morning, I asked her why she kept having this sort of dream. And without hesitation, she told me. In the ghetto, the woman who lived directly above me on the 3rd floor had a beautiful baby boy. He must have been about 6 months old when the Nazis came for him. Knowing what the Nazis did to babies, she threw him out the window. She wanted him to die from her hand and not the Nazis. You saw this, Mother? I saw that happen. Somehow I could see it too, and it was terrifying. I ran to my room and I cried. By the time I was 10 years old, my mother no longer screamed in the night. That was 1968, 23 years after her liberation from Bergen-Belsen. Yeah. I guess I say that, read that story, and I can still, it still shakes me, right? My heart starts pounding.
And everyone's different, and we all react differently to hearing those kinds of stories. And what I find interesting is you heard the story, and you went back and you were interested, and you kept asking your mother for more stories. You wanted to know more.
Mhm.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And you're wondering why didn't I just recede and not?
No, I'm not wondering why. I'm just commenting that it's amazing that you were able to go back and hear more. I was very different, and maybe my parents and I weren't as well matched as I think you and your parents were, and Joy and hers were. My father my mother, I could hear her story. She was a hidden child. I've since come to understand the trauma and the impact it had on her. But at the time, my father, I must have been 10 years old. He wanted to tell me about what the Holocaust was like. So he sits with me and we watch this film, Night and Fog, which is black and white footage of Auschwitz during the war, horrible pictures during liberation of the camps with the people and the skeletons. And I sat there on the couch and I couldn't look at my father. I couldn't look at the TV. I knew not to say that I can't watch. And that was really a defining moment for me, that I shut down. It was so painful for me to imagine my father like that I didn't want to hear about the Holocaust from him at all. And over the years, when he spoke to me, I'm sure I heard what he was saying, or I looked like I was listening. I blocked it out. It was just so painful for me to think that was my father. And, am I angry that he did the wrong thing? Back then they didn't have, parenting groups. There weren't self-help books on how to tell your daughter about Auschwitz. They did the best that they could. And what I've come to realize is back then PTSD wasn't considered a legitimate syndrome until 1980. So perhaps our parents thought that, well, gee, if we're not supposed to be impacted by what we went through, maybe our kids aren't going to be impacted by hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
So that
yeah,
was
I mean,
interesting.
I think some of the things my mother told me, she told me awfully young, and I really think because she didn't have a filter, and I asked and she told me, and I think it's lucky that I didn't. I mean, I like I said, I can see it. Everything she told me, I can see. I feel like, I embody it. Although, I know I didn't obviously experience it, but I guess is there a right way or a wrong way? I don't know.
Not at all. We're all different. Many survivors did not talk. Our parents did. And, I think this is a good example how you heard, these stories early and was able to take it and ask for more. I couldn't. Not right or wrong, we're just different.
Yeah, exactly.
Joy.
Yes.
When you talk about your mother, and I'll ask you to read the part about her putting on her leg, where Joy's mother had, as you'll hear, serious injury. And you'll hear when Joy talks about what it was like for her, it's a very different tone and way of talking than I think my father spoke to me. So if you'll share that.
Okay, I have to change glasses, sorry.
Not a problem.
Lying in the twin bed in my tiny bedroom in New York City, down the hall from my parents, I was sometimes awakened by the guttural German and Polish cries of my father's nightmares, and sometimes by the sound of my mother, hopping on one foot from her bed to her bathroom. As a child, I thought it was normal that in the evenings, daddies took off their shoes and socks, their shirts and trousers, and mommies took off their skirts and blouses, their brassieres and girdles, and their wooden leg. The leg was a triumph of the sculptor's art. The wood stained to match my mother's skin tone. It had 2 different screw-on feet to accommodate flats and high heels. The interior of the socket was sanded smooth beneath a heavy coat of varnish designed to protect the stump from abrasions and open sores. My fascination with the leg's aesthetic was offset by the more sobering experience of watching my mother put it on. This involved a laborious maneuver. First, lubricating the stump with Menin's medicated talcum powder, which rose in a perfumed cloud that lodged in my nose and settled on the bed covers, before suctioning it into the socket. The process involved a nakedness that my older brother John was not permitted to witness. That intimacy was the province of a daughter. It was such a complicated and time-consuming ordeal that if my mother woke up in the middle of the night to pee, she would skip it. Thus, the hop, hop, hopping sound that punctuated my sleep.
You said when you wrote that you almost thought it was normal. And there's something about, tell us about the way in which your mother framed her story and her life that, you know, it's almost like it wasn't a big deal. She didn't,
Sure.
How was it?
Yeah, so, you know, my mother, when I think about it, well before there were no self-help books, as you said, there was no how-to book for them to follow. There wasn't a phrase, PTSD. But my mother was a storyteller. She was a writer. She wrote poetry in the camps. Her sister Ilona wrote poetry in the camps on stolen scraps of paper smuggled in from the slave labor factory. They had had a progressive education at the Hebrew Gymnasium of Krakow. They studied Polish literature alongside Hebrew and religious studies. And she had a knack for unspooling things from a very early age, but in what turned out to be a very age-appropriate manner. So it had a fairy tale arc to it, her stories. There was the idyllic childhood, there was the terrible time with a horrible ogre, and then there was the end of the story where, for the purposes of a young child, 3, 4, 5 years old, you know, as long as the bad guy dies and the good guys survive, that's the happy ending of the fairy tale. And my mother would tell these stories, various stories over and over again, because I was such a terrible eater that it was her last ditch effort after all the other tactics. You know, calling me string bean didn't do it. Calling me soup green didn't do it. But if she said, if you eat your soup down to the bottom, I'll tell you the story of how Aunt Dora became a pediatrician, of how I played with my grandmother in the park in Warsaw, I gobbled up those stories and choked down the food along the way. Then I got old enough to start peppering her with why, you know, what happened to Aunt Dora? What happened to everybody else? And then she would say they died in the war. And I would say, why? And she would pause and struggle for an answer and finally say, it's what God wanted. And then years later, when she took, you know, a creative writing class at the nearby Catholic college in our neighborhood in the Bronx, she wrote an essay that recalled that conversation and concluded, God was invented by a mother who could no longer answer her child's questions.
Right.
Wow.
So, yes, you and your mother were well matched, and it's, you know, really interesting about how she framed it. And when, you know, I approached it from a place of fear, that you wanted to know your mother's life. I didn't want to know my father's pain. For years, anytime I would look at, you know, photos, I still do to this day, and I don't think I'm the only child of survivors, you're looking for your parent. You see the striped uniform, you're looking for your parent, and at the same time, hoping that I don't see my father there. I don't want to see my father like that. So it's, you know, kind of like rubbernecking that I don't want to see it.
I
So
totally
it's-
relate to that. You know, a couple of years back around Yom HaShoah, there was a picture of the Jews of Krakow being marched to the Pashtuv camp across the, from the ghetto to the Pashtuv camp. And I must have just expanded that photo till it was a complete blur because I wanted to see my mother. I wanted to see my grandmother. And of course I didn't. But in that moment, I could really picture their pain. And that's a lot. How deeply can we enter into that pain before we get overwhelmed ourselves?
Well, I wasn't looking for a photo that I found a photo of my grandfather in 1945 at Liberation. He was 50 years old, still
Wow.
wearing his uniform. The life was, I have a picture of him in 1938, my father's bar mitzvah. Unrecognizable between those 7 years. The life was sucked at him. And I knew my grandfather until, he passed away in 1980. He never smiled. I was scared of him. I didn't understand him. When I saw that photo, it broke down. And it really, I looked at him in a different way. How could I be angry at someone who looked like this? He was broken. He had gone through so much. So when we talk about looking, we want to see the pictures. It was very hard for me to see this picture. I in some ways, I wish I hadn't. And I'm sure you can relate to this. I wrote an article, which was really cathartic, and I came to terms with understanding it. So let me ask you, in terms of the writing process, what was it like for either one of you can answer first? What was it like for you? Did you start off with reflecting a certain way on your childhood, and did that change during the process? How you feel about your experience and your parents, and to this day, what was that like?
Can you start?
Sure.
I wrote it twice, my chapter, and the first time I don't know, I didn't have a rhythm, but I felt like I was going through I don't know, maybe the motions, like what I thought I was supposed to write. And the second time, I tried to see myself as a child through it, and well, through a child's eyes, but also as an adult. I feel in some ways that I benefited. Well, it's a lot of what you said, that we were impacted, not necessarily traumatized. There was definitely trauma, and I know I'm impacted. And I feel very resilient and strong because of them. And I feel like I have greater depth of understanding of pain and sorrow. I think I have more empathy. I think I understand the immigrant, like when immigrants are coming in, I just, my ability to feel are much more expanded because of my parents, and I'm really grateful to them. And when I came to it from that place and looked at my childhood through those eyes, I saw the gifts of my father's teaching, and as well as my mother's stories, and could see how that impacted me. And maybe the lessons that I learned then, but that I can put into words now, that I hadn't put into words until we wrote the chapter. So that was very powerful for me.
I would say that I was a reluctant memoirist. After that kind of very good match with my mother as a young child, and being temperamentally very much like my father, as my mother got older, particularly after she passed the age that her own mother had been when she died, my mother had really terrible anxiety and leaned, not just physically because of her wooden leg when we were walking, but also emotionally leaned very, very hard on both my brother and me. And it was burdensome. And we were adolescents and young adults, and there was a lot of resentment about that. But there was also a tremendous press to protect our parents, any further suffering. So that sense of protectiveness, when it's the right ratio, does solicit a lot of empathy in one's adult life, just as Natalie described. But it also did not give much space to feel our own feelings a lot of the time growing up. So when we started writing, and we were kind of throwing writing prompts at each other before we hired a professional developmental editor to read our chapters and ask really probing questions, a lot of the questions that I received at the time was, well, how did you feel about that as a child? Or did you ever tell your parents that you were frightened? And I realized it never occurred to me to tell my parents that I was frightened. Why would I tell them I was frightened of yahrzeit candles when they were lighting them after in response to such a horrific sorrow? Like, the mantra growing up was, if I had anything from a boo-boo to, a bad experience with a friend, was, may this be the worst thing that ever happens to you. So what did my sorrows count, right? So taking that deep dive was almost a reparenting experience for myself, to have permission to feel the full range of emotion about growing up. And the end result of that was more self-compassion and more compassion for my parents, which I think is a win-win.
Right. There's no way as children, any of us could have possibly understood what our parents went through. It's unfathomable, and how it impacted us. And, decades later, here with maturity and life experiences, certainly in the people that I talk with in my discussion groups, it's so interesting to reflect back on it with a different perspective. Everything looks totally different. And there was people who came from whose parents didn't always say the nicest things, who said painful, hurtful things, understandably. But understanding it as an adult takes away a lot of the sting and a lot of the hate. There's one woman who several years ago, somebody asked her, she said something, oh, my mother was mean. And over the course of a couple of years, somebody new asked her about her mother, and she said, my mother said mean things, as opposed to my mother was mean. And that little change and shift is really healthy. And I think that that's what you've done, and what I think is important to do also.
Well, yeah, we wrote this book when we were in our 60s and 70s by and large. And, I recently had occasion to reread Helen Epstein's Children of the Holocaust, which I must say holds up as journalism after all these years.
Absolutely.
Reading the accounts of, the 2G experience in our 20s, my first reaction was, oh, don't make me go back there. And my second was realizing what a different book this would have been had we tackled this issue younger in our life cycle. We do gain perspective and compassion and wisdom about all of this stuff as we age.
And I feel that, this is not only important to understand for descendants, when you hope, the non-descendants listening here, I think it's really interesting to see how we have choices. We want to decide what we want to take of our parents' stories. They had enough that they could have been, stayed in bed the rest of their lives. We certainly could feel down and depressed, just thinking about what they went through and what we went through. And it's wonderful to be able to work through it and come out the other side. After the war, when the war ended, most survivors had absolutely nothing. The clothes on their back, no possessions, nothing. And what little they had, they cherished. And the three of us, each one of us, has something very important and memorable that our mothers had. So we'd like to share that with you. So Natalie, let's go first and tell us about what you have and what it means.
I will read my section first, and I'll do my show and tell. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. I didn't tell you this. My mother was from Łódź, Poland, and was in the Łódź ghetto. And in the fall of '44, she was taken to Auschwitz, and that's kind of where this starts. After my mother and sisters were separated from their mother and aunt, they were held along the railroad tracks between Auschwitz and Birkenau for about 2 days and then stuffed on trucks to be taken to a concentration camp in the hinterland of Germany. As a truck pulled away, Franca, my mother, told me, she cried out, "How will my mother find us?" Another woman said, "See that smoke? That's your mother." My mother slapped her and said, "This is the 20th century. People don't do that." She and her sisters never saw her mother or aunt again. Like her mother, my mother was an exceptionally independent woman. She insisted on working when other women didn't work. In addition to her job at Siemens Jewish Bakery in Detroit, she had a side gig. She was a talented and skilled knitter, having learned to knit as an 8-year-old in school in Lodz. When she wasn't in the bakery, there were a group of women, usually relatives, over in the afternoon knitting at our kitchen table, getting instructions from my mother. Sometimes she was knitting with them. Oftentimes she was going about her chores, ironing or making dinner, while helping correct drop stitches and instructing on how to make a desired pattern. One day, when I was 10, while searching for the needles she wanted in her needle case, my mother showed me an unusual pair. Then she told me the story of these knitting needles, which had their origins in one of the smaller concentration camps she'd been sent to in Germany. Now I know that it was a subcamp of Ravensbrück. My mother said that the head of this camp was a World War I veteran, and he was not cruel. But still, the Jewish prisoners, all of them girls, were starved and poorly dressed for the upcoming winter. My mother said that her sisters and herself worked in the ammunition factory nearby. Mala, her younger sister, and my mother worked the day shift, and her sister Lolo the night shift. Wounded soldiers and people from the village worked alongside them in these ammunition camp. One day, she told me, a middle-aged woman, she said about her mother's age, came up to her and said, "Pretend I'm fixing your machine." And she leaned over and said, "They told us that you're criminals. You're such young girls. What did you do?" And my mother said, "Our crime is we're Jewish." And she said, "Son Juden." And I think this woman my mother said she didn't think this woman had ever seen a Jew before. She didn't know what a Jew was. And she said to her, "What can I do to help you?" And my mother said, "Winter's coming. We don't have stockings. If I had knitting needles, I could tear the threads off the blankets and I could knit stockings for my sister and myself." The next day, when she got to her workstation, she had a little box for her tools, and she opened it, and there were knitting needles. Now, they weren't really knitting needles, but they were.
Show us that.
I'm going to show them to you right now. They were bicycle spokes with cork on the end, and I hope you can see that pretty clearly. Now, so my mother did that. She made those stockings, and she said that woman would smile at her, and it meant the world to her because she was about her mother's age and she had lost her mother.
And those knitting needles meant the world to your mother, that she held on to them for all those years and
well,
and
yeah,
here you
that
have
was the last camp. She went to several other camps after, but somehow she didn't have a suitcase or a pocket to put them in. She just stayed, and she lived in 3 other countries. And when she died, I looked for them, and there they were amongst her beautiful sets of knitting needles. So they
they cherished whatever they had. I'm gonna Sydney, whenever you're ready to show my mother. I have an autograph book from my mother. It was 1938. She was in Vienna, and her family got together to say goodbye. Some of the family were going to the land of Israel, other the United States. My mother's 8 years old, and here are what her 5-year-old and 13-year-old cousins wrote to her. Actually, cousin Ruth on the right-hand side, she's 98 years old, and I believe she's watching this. And I went and showed her this a couple of years ago. They survived, and they ended up sponsoring my mother in 1947. On the next page, you know, I don't understand how, I never asked, how did my mother have this? She left Vienna in the middle of the night. They had to sneak through Germany with false papers, go through the woods to Belgium. How did my mother keep this autograph book? And the answer was, when you're told to flee and you're an 8-year-old kid, maybe you're told, take one thing of importance. And that's what my mother took. She took this book, and I didn't have an understanding for it. It was next to her bed on the night table. I always looked at it as a child. And I've come to understand that she held on to this book. This was her family. Some of what the people wrote was, these are from her teenage cousins. Even if you will be afraid of life, even if it's hell on earth, please continue to trust in God. It will be better soon, an eternal love. Another, her aunt said, remain faithful, be courageous, and no destiny will bring you down and apart your ways. The eternal memory of your aunt. These are from children when my mother was hidden before she went to the convent. She was hidden on a farm. Her parents paid for her to stay there, and then the family didn't want her anymore. They were scared. She made friends, and she had the children, the boy and the girl, Marguerite and Marcel, from the farm write to her. And she held on to this book, as you were saying, through all these countries, through all these experiences. And this is another book that it's in French, from the convent. You know, beautiful penmanship, beautiful writings, and there's one more picture. And the importance of these pieces to our mothers, it's a connection, it's a memory, it's you know, it's bittersweet that an 8-year-old has this book with her family saying, you know, goodbye. I hope you live. I hope we live, and I hope we see each other again. And yeah, so these are my treasures now.
Those pictures are just stunning.
There's 2 books. They're incredible, from 1938. And the words in there are really, really telling. Joy, I think we have time where all of a sudden this is just, we could go on for hours. We have so much to say. Did you want to share about your mother, or I can?
Yeah, just very briefly. So I mentioned that my mother and aunt wrote poetry in the camps, and there were transports and death marches, and my mother sewed the sheets of paper into the hem of her prison uniform. And at the end, you know, in the death march, where the so-called accident that resulted in the loss of legs, she gave the manuscript to a cousin who was marching by and pleaded for her to find my father and give them to him. And it's a long story in my chapter, but that is what happened. And the poems were later published in Polish, and in 2007 in English. This is a picture of my mother and aunt in Stockholm after the war. My aunt is still in a wheelchair. My mother is hiding her pregnant belly. And when my brother was born in Stockholm, my mother kept a journal in which she wrote him letters, including a promise to create a legend to secure the immortality of all of the loved ones that we lost. And we still have that journal and her unmistakable, very hard to decipher handwriting from Stockholm in 1946. She kept her promise. She created legends.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Great. I'm going to turn to some of the questions. Some of them we've answered in the discussion. Here's an interesting one. Do you feel that, do you think that one can ever understand the Holocaust if they did not live through it? I'd like to answer it quickly first. I don't think if someone lived through it, they can understand the Holocaust. And the more I think about it and the more I learn about it, the less I understand. You know, usually if you want to know about something, you read about it, you talk about it, you understand more. The more I read and I talk, the less I understand. The less I understand about how people could have behaved barbaric and done that. And I marvel and am in awe of survivors that they could have wanted to survive, that they did, that they went through the unimaginable, and they came out living and loving and producing families, and you know, that to me is what's important. So I don't know if anybody who do you either of you think it's different if somebody who's not the child of a descendant to understand versus us? Do you think they can? You think there's a little bit of a difference?
No, I think it's utterly incomprehensible, just as you said. And I think no matter how much sympathy and empathy we have, we cannot imagine. It is beyond imagining. You know, the fairy tale stories I heard buffered some of the hardest aspects of them.
Yes.
And now that I read, you know, some of the books that are visible behind me on the shelf, and I realize the depth of horror that, you know, my parents and my grandparents, everybody went through, it feels more distant from my comprehension.
Right. And I, you know, it took me many years. It wasn't, my father passed away in 2008. It wasn't until 2016 that I was ready to sit down and watch my father's testimonials. And he made several of them. And he describes in detail horrible, horrific things. And that I watched them at the right time when I was ready. And every time I hear them and I hear about the death march, I walk away not understanding. I try and come up with explanations, but you know, it defies biology, it defies science. It's just so incomprehensible. Let me ask you this. Are there any questions that you wish you would ask your parents?
I wish I had asked my father specific names of relatives. You know, I wish I had a really good family tree, because I don't have that. Yeah, I don't know the names, and I know more of my mother's, those that were lost. I asked my father, and I also asked my father to write his story for me. He wrote it in Yiddish, so I've gotten some of the pages translated, but not all of them. I want to know more about his journey. Well, those are the questions I wish I'd asked.
I wish I'd asked my father more questions. He was very reticent. He was the youngest of 11 in a big Hasidic family. He had one brother that went to Palestine in the 30s, and the rest all perished. And I wish I had asked my father more stories about his brothers and sisters.
If your parents were to know that you had written this chapter, that you're involved, that you're talking, that we're here tonight talking, would they be surprised?
No, I mean, I started being involved while they were still alive. And I remember in college, I was taking a writing class, and I had to write, I don't know, maybe I can't remember the topic, but I ended up writing about my mother, and it was about 2 pages. And after I'd written it, I showed it to my mother, and like she showed it to everybody. You know, like she was really proud that I cared about her, her and her story.
I would echo that. I wrote a couple of scholarly papers in graduate school, and my mother was still alive. They were both alive to read those papers, and again, you know, showed it off to all their friends. My chapter kind of revealing more about their anxiety and depression and struggles. I've come around on that. I have said for a long time I could never have written this chapter while they were alive, but we have 2 authors who are fortunate enough to have living parents, both of whom have loved their chapters, warts and all. And I would like to believe that my parents would have been proud, and that above all, they would have seen in my chapter and in all the other chapters what one reviewer described as a silver thread of gratitude that runs through the book.
That's true.
Runs through do you know, there's 16 authors. Oh, Joy, then I forgot to ask the title of your chapter. What's the title of your chapter and what does it mean?
It's called One Day the World Will Be the World Again. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was with my mother and aunt throughout. My grandfather had been picked off and deported in 1942, but my mother was with her mother to the very end, including the accident where they were all run over by a tank and left behind for dead. My grandmother did not survive that, but during the worst of times in the camps, when people were behaving in an animalistic way, sometimes because they were having an animalistic existence, my grandmother would consistently say to my mother and aunt, one day the world will be the world again. You have to remember how to behave. And that became a real kind of moral compass in my family when I was growing up.
The other author in general, there's 16 authors, and you know, everyone, as we know, is impacted differently. In general, would you say there was commonalities between how they were impacted and how they view it at this point in their life, or were most of the survivors, were there lessons of resiliency and strength, or was it only the trauma?
You know, I think anybody that picks them, I mean, the title of my graduate school paper was, and then they had children. I think it's baked in. If you go through such horrors and you pick yourself up and you leave your, except for one, with only one exception, leave your country of origin, immigrate somewhere else, create a new life, get work which is more often than not beneath your level of aspiration, and raise families and raise a generation of kind of your basic overachievers that go into the helping professions. You know, it's kind of impossible not to see the resilience from a young age. I think that we, you know, some experience the impact more harshly than others. Some had parents that were very abusive, and were impacted differently in their adaptations as adults. But here we all are, you know, authors now on the book talk circuit now, telling stories with a mission to, you know, sound the alarm about what can happen if you are bystanders to human rights abuses and assaults on democracy. And we're all doing that. So we all are resilient. But I think that we have in common. We all admire our parents' adaptations, that we have in common. But then there's, you know, every chapter tells a very different story.
Well said.
Right. And, you know, it's important, as I said before, to know that, you know, what happened isn't just in a vacuum. It didn't just happen then. It's there. It's there for us. It's there for, you know, impacts our children as well. It's there. Can't avoid it.
Generational trauma. Yes, right. Generational trauma.
I used to joke about what was the soup I was cooked in my mother's uterus, and it turns out that there's now a biological basis for that question.
Well, the word is still up in the air. There's still research to be done. There may be, you know, it's far beyond the DNA change and far beyond my level of science. But to me, whether it's biological or environmental or some combination there, and it isn't what's, I don't need to differentiate. I know it's there. I know we're impacted, and that's. Any closing thoughts? Question? You glad you did this? You want to continue?
Yeah, you know, I think, I mean, writing the book was its own amazing experience, but doing the book talks have been a whole other level of meeting different people, going deeper, like some of the things that you have mentioned and talked about, and what we've talked about today are new. And it makes me keep going deeper into it. And so I really appreciate that. And while we don't have an audience today, but in other book talks where we've had an audience, the connections have been amazing. Jew or non-Jew, it doesn't matter. There's just been this incredible connection with people that I really value. And I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah, and you know, the conversations, when you go deeper, you come out with more of an understanding. And I don't know if Sydney put up in the chat, but if anyone's interested in information on the discussion groups that I run, please, you can put your name in the chat. They're virtual, and there's a lot that we get out of it. So you can put your name in the chat, or you can email me as well. So Sydney, are you back here with us?
Yes, sorry,
Okay.
I type and do too many things at once.
No, yeah, I mean, if it was up to the three of us, we could be here for a couple more hours.
Yes, I could listen also for a couple more hours. So I want to thank all three of you for this really amazing discussion. I learned so much, and thank you so much, Ellen, for organizing this, and to Descendants of Holocaust Survivors for co-presenting this with us.